meeting of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System Budget Development Committee. I am your chair, Vivian Moreno. Clerk, please proceed with the roll call.
Good morning. Just as a reminder, please turn on your mic while speaking. Moreno,
Present.
Goble,
Present.
McCann,
Present.
Montgomery Seb is absent. Woodburn is absent. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, clerk. Let's move on to item number 2, which is public comment. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak? Okay, hearing none. We're going to move on to item number 3, which is the approval of the minutes for our meeting on March 24th, 2022. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak, clerk?
We have no public comments.
Thank you. This is an action item, so we need a motion and a second.
Motion to approve.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a motion. May I have a second?
Second.
Wonderful. So we have a motion and a second. So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, motion passes unanimously. And I should have mentioned the motion was made by Councilmember Goble and was seconded by Mayor McCann. I forget, we don't videotape these meetings. So we're going to move on to our committee discussion item. Item number 4 is the fiscal year 2024 operating budget discussion. Mr. Meyer is here. And how many minutes will you need? And feel free to start.
The presentation, probably about 40 minutes, and then time for questions, maybe an hour max.
Wonderful. The floor is yours.
Good morning. My name is Gordon Meyer. I'm the manager of financial planning here at MTS. This morning, I'm going to provide the first look at our proposed FY25 operating budget. So before we start looking at the figures, I wanted to give a brief overview of our budgeting process. So MTS does use a zero-based budgeting process. So in a traditional historic budgeting process, managers only need to justify the variances versus the prior year. In that framework, the assumption is that the baseline is automatically approved. By contrast, in a zero-based budgeting process, every line item must be approved each year, whether or not it was approved in prior budgets before. And so in these presentations, we're typically only able to talk about the changes due to time constraints. We have thousands of lines in our budget, but it is built from the ground up, and we look at each item in detail. And so our process begins in January. During that time, we meet with the managers from every department. We review their current expense and revenue trends. We discuss, and we also have them justify each line item detail in their budgets. Once we're comfortable with all of our assumptions, and we roll those up first into the mid-year amendment, which just went to the board and was approved in April. And then we look at the next year's budget shortly after that. And in this case, we're looking at FY25. And so the draft that you're seeing today is a rough draft. We're still finalizing a few of our assumptions, as we'll touch on later. And so now we'll look at the figures, and first we'll look at subsidy revenue. And within subsidy, we'll first look at sales tax revenues. MTS has 3 different sales tax revenues, and the first we'll look at is Transnet. So Transnet is the 1/2 cent sales tax that's assessed in the region, and it's administered by Sandag. So each year, Sandag provides us with a projection of the regional sales tax receipts. Their projection for FY25 is for $434 million, which represents a 1% growth assumption over the FY24 Sandag budget. We also receive a forecast from a company called Avenue, who is contracted by Sandag to do their own independent sales tax forecast. And they're projecting $441 million for the region, which represents a 2.7% growth over the Sandag FY24 budget. And so the FY25 draft of our budget that we're looking at today uses Avenue's more aggressive forecast of $441 million for the region. And the reason we're comfortable using that more aggressive forecast is that we just met with Sandag and Avenue on Wednesday. We typically come in slightly favorable to Sandag's number historically, and then also Avenue went through their forecast again and felt comfortable overall that they weren't being too aggressive. And so we are using the $441 million target. And just, I did want to point out that as you look at the out years, FY26 or FY28, there's quite a divergence between Avenue's forecast and Sandag's. So this is something we'll be monitoring very closely as each agency or each avenue in Sandag refine their forecasts in future years as well. So of the 441 million regional total, it gets split out according to the formulas represented in the chart to the right. So 33% of that pot goes to the local system improvements, which is to the county and cities for road repairs. 42% goes to the major corridors program, which includes major capital projects such as Midcoast and BRT when those projects were in construction. And then there's a 8% which goes to new operations. So this is what provides us with our reimbursement for operations costs for our Transnet funded services each year. For us, that includes BRT, Superloop, and Midcoast operations. And based on our projected expenses and revenues, we're expecting to receive $33.5 million in cost recovery for those services in FY25. And then we did think it's worth mentioning here that we're only expected to receive full cost recovery from Transnet for these services through 2030, which is earlier than the sunsetting of Transnet 2, and that's based on the Transnet shortfall projected by Sandag as we look further down the road. And then lastly, we have 17% of the regional total that goes to operation or transit system improvements. So this is what provides us with our formula funding each year. There's a share that goes to the region that gets split between MTS and North County by about a 70-30% split. So our apportionment is projected at just under 48 million for FY25. And of the 48, $5.5 million goes to fare discounts for the senior, disabled, and youth passes, and then the remaining 42.4 million can be used for bus and trolley operations. So next we have TDA, or Transportation Development Act. So that's the statewide quarter-cent sales tax. So this one, Sandag also apportions each year. And for this, Sandag provides the apportionment, and that is the amount that we can claim. And so we file a claim in the beginning of the year, and we know for certain that that's the amount of revenue we'll receive, regardless of sales tax performance. So if sales tax receipts come in higher than Sandag's budget, then the excess revenue goes into a reserve at the county. And if they come in lower, then we draw from that reserve at the county to make sure we receive that claim amount that we filed. And so this funding does provide funding for the operating budget as well as the CIP. For FY25, Sandag has a slightly negative growth assumption of negative 0.1%. You can see the regional forecast highlighted in the purple bar with the arrow over it for this year. That equates to a 206 million regional total for FY25. For this one, the Avenue and Sandag forecast are fairly close, but we have reached out to Sandag to explore what the process would be to claim an amount higher than what they were initially published. It'll be more important in the following years where you can see there's a larger divergence, but once again, between Sandag and Avenue forecasts. And so sharing with the region and Sandag, our MTS apportionment is estimated to be 131.5 million for FY25. And based on our sharing between the operating and capital budgets, we have 90 million going to the operating budget and the remaining 46 million going to the CIP. So last, sales tax revenue, we have state transit assistance, or STA. So this is derived from the state sales tax on diesel fuel. So it's a recurring formula fund that's administered by the state, and it's distributed based on population as well as agency revenue. Back in FY18, the funding was augmented by Senate Bill 1, which slightly increased the STA formula each year and also introduced a state of good repair funding source that was smaller and only eligible for capital expenditures. We don't like to put a lot of this in the operating budget because of its volatile history. There is a history of the state diverting these funds for meeting its general fund obligations. And then it's also tied to diesel fuel sales, which has been a declining commodity, and we expect it to be a declining commodity going forward. And as mentioned, this can be used for operations and capital. The total allocation for FY25 is projected at 39 million, of which we plan on putting 11.3 million in the operating budget, which is an increase of 2.9 million over FY24. The 11.3 figure is a number that we typically keep static in the operating budget for the last 5 or 6 years. We brought it down in FY '24 because we had a shortfall of STA and we wanted to keep the capital budget whole. So we reduced it in operations. But for FY '25, we're bringing it back up to 11.3 and then putting the rest of it in the FY '25 capital improvement program. So another major source of funding for us in the operating budget is the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA. So they provide a variety of formula funds that we receive. And our formula funds come from the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. The most recent reauthorization was from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed in December of 2021, which extended this funding through September 30th of 2026 and also dramatically increased our funding levels. And so you can see in our fiscal year 23, you can see the dramatic increase in overall funding. And then you can also see how it's been split between operations and capital. You can see the red bars, which are operating, have increased slightly over the years. And then the blue bars, which is capital, is where we put almost all of that increase. And so, as mentioned, this funding can be used in capital or operations, but if it's used for operations, it primarily has to be used for preventive maintenance, so which is basically any maintenance costs within our operating budget. And so this funding is received on a reimbursement basis. So unlike the sales tax revenues, here we incur the costs and then we submit a reimbursement package to the federal government. And typically or historically, MTS has sought to maximize the amount of preventive maintenance funds that we put in our operating budget, and it's for cash flow purposes. So we have 62 million going to preventive maintenance in this budget draft. If we had taken that 62 million and put it into a capital project that might take 2 to 5 years, then we're significantly limiting the cash that we're able to generate. And so it has been a financial practice of ours to do that over the years. And then the next bullet I have is for the last foreseeable past, it has been our practice that anytime we increase the amount of federal preventive maintenance funds in our operating budget, so for example, this year we're increasing it by 2 million, that we take an equal amount of TDA and we move it from the operating budget and put it into the capital budget to keep the capital budget whole or kind of at its maximum level. And so as we begin to start addressing our structural deficit, we think that's an area that we can definitely change that practice and something to keep in mind as we get to the later slides. And so bottom line is that the recurring formula funds from the FTA are increasing by just under $2 million, and that's because of the increase in preventive maintenance in our budget based on increasing maintenance expenses. And then not mentioned on this slide is that we also have $750,000 in additional FTA funding from a one-time competitive grant that we're including, which you'll see on the revenue summary later. And that's from a planning grant that provided funding for the Baltimore and Euclid planning studies. Next, we have the Senate Bill 125 or SB 125 funding. So this was the $4 billion in state funding that's distributed to the transit agency through the TIRCP program. It's distributed based on population. It can fund either operations or capital, but it has to meet very strict criteria for increasing service, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or serving disadvantaged communities. So the original legislation has MTS receiving $284 million over multiple fiscal years. Based on discussions at the state level as they try to balance their budget, there is uncertainty regarding at a minimum the timing of when we receive these funds, and then worst case would be that we don't end up receiving this full amount. And this funding does require an appropriation each year, so these discussions are continue for the next few years. Regardless of what the future looks like, we will receive what we're programming in this year's budget, which is $19.7 million. And that's for the activities described below, highlighted by the increased service for both bus and trolley, as well as the full year of security enhancements. And then lastly, for subsidy revenue, we have a couple other categories. So we receive fast track toll revenue from SANDAG. The toll revenue that we receive is from the I-15 managed lanes. And we receive funding that subsidizes the services in the I-15 corridor. So for MTS, we receive $1 million to fund the rapid express routes. And then we also receive $2.5 million to fund the I-15 BRT routes. And so we're going to receive $3.5 million in total for FY25, which is the same amount that we received in FY24. And then lastly, we have some smaller revenue agreements. We have an agreement with the city of San Diego, as well as an agreement with UCSD, where we receive reimbursement for operating their campus shuttle. In total, that revenue is projected to be about $800,000 for FY25. So we covered subsidy. Now we'll move on to operating revenues, highlighted by passenger revenue. So we just had the mid-year budget that we developed and was approved in April. So that's the orange bar on the chart to the right. So since that time, we've received January, February, and March revenue as well as ridership. And during that time, we were almost spot on with our ridership estimates, but we missed budget significantly because of average fare. So we budgeted 98 cents and we're at 95 cents through March at this time. And so we missed budget by a total of about $1 million from January to March, all driven by average fare. And so considering that, we are projecting about 7.5% growth for next year for FY25, which comes out to about $80.1 million in projected fare revenue. And that's built on an assumption of 82.1 million passengers, or a 7.3% growth in ridership. And then we are still using an average fare of 98 cents, but for a couple reasons. We think we can still achieve that. One, we're implementing the open payment fare system upgrade. It's planned for mid-May, and that's where people will be able to tap their credit card instead of having the Pronto card itself. And then we're in the process of hiring all the additional security staff, and so we're going to have a lot more visibility on the trolley lines. And we do think that those two things combined, that we should get back closer to our original assumption of 98 cents. And then lastly, within operating revenues, we have a variety of miscellaneous revenues. So I wanted to give an update on the energy credits. So refresher, we generate funding from the low carbon fuel standard, which is a state program, as well as the renewable identification number system, which is a federal program. In FY24, we had brought our mid-year budgeted LCFS price target down from up in the mid-90s down to $70. For FY25, we're leaving it at $70 until we start seeing data and we actually start to see that price go up. There was talk last year from CARB where it was expected for it to go up, but we just haven't seen that. So we're going to take kind of a wait and see approach with the LCFS price. And then on the RIN side, we've had a really good year for all of FY24. We've been above $3. However, if you look historically, just even back to FY23, we spent a large portion of the year right around $2. And so we're budgeting for kind of the historical middle ground of a $2.50. We don't feel comfortable budgeting above $3 for the entire year. And so we are bringing that down. Also built into this forecast is we are building in additional credit generation based on our planned service increases. But because of the decrease in the RINs price, we are projecting a decrease in energy credit funding of about $584,000 from the mid-year budget. Next, we have real estate related revenues. So that's mostly lease income. So we're increasing the budget here by just over $900,000. That's additional revenue that we're generating from 3 parcels that we've purchased related to the Clean Transit Advancement Campus, or Division 6 project. So those parcels have tenants and we're generating additional income. Interest, we're increasing the budget by $1.3 million. That's due to the influx of cash that we're scheduled to receive in April. We're supposed to receive $118 million for the first half of our SB 125 funds, which we'll be generating interest on. And then lastly, we have a category for other, which includes a variety of other sources that's increasing by $1.1 million in total. And so for FY25, we're projecting $31.2 million for these other operating revenues, which is an increase of about $2.8 million from the FY24 budget. So here you can see a summary of all the revenues that we just talked about. So our operating revenues, which is passenger revenue in the other categories, is increasing by 8.3 million or almost 8%. Below that, we have the subsidy revenues. So our recurring federal is increasing by 2.7 million. That's a combination of the 2 million in additional preventive maintenance funds, as well as the 750,000 for route restoration, the competitive grant. And then big mover, we can see the federal stimulus funds. So we're budgeting the last of our stimulus funds, which is 47 million, which we'll use in FY25, and then we'll start drawing from the operating deficit reserve at that time. TDA in the operating budget is decreasing by 3 million. That's partially due to the negative growth assumption from Sandag, but more so due to that swapping mechanism that we talked about, where we're increasing preventive maintenance funds by 2 million, and then we're moving 2 million in TDA to the capital budget. Transnet formula increasing by less than 1%. The operating piece, which is the reimbursement, is increasing by 2.6 million based on the projected net expenses for those services. STA bringing back to 11.3 million. Other big movers, SB 125, where we're programming just under 20 million for FY25. So in total, our subsidy revenue is projected at 321 million for FY25, which is a decrease of almost 18 million or 5.2% from the FY24 budget. And then next line, you can see the reserves. So we had a negative number in the FY24 amended budget. That's because we're planning on contributing to the operating deficit reserve. FY25 is the first year where we need to use these funds to balance our budget. And so we have a positive 22 million included in order to balance our budget for FY25. So in total, our revenue is projected at 457 million, which is an increase of 43 million over the FY24 amended budget. So moving on to expenses. So a main driver of our expenses is our service levels. And so FY25, we have significant service increases planned, mainly related to our SB 125 funding. And so on the rail side, we're increasing frequency to 15-minute service on all lines and to 7.5-minute service on the blue line during peak periods. Overall, that equates to about a 15% increase in service levels over FY24. On the fixed route bus side, we're restoring service reductions that were implemented in FY23 due to the driver shortage. We also have a full year of Iris Rapid operations. And then we're also implementing new services such as the overnight Blue Line bus service, as well as frequency increases. And so in total on the bus side, we're increasing service by about 7% versus FY24 levels. And then lastly, we have paratransit. So this is a demand-based service, and we're planning for just over a 17% increase in demand. It sounds like a big number, but that still puts us at less than 3/4 of our pre-COVID baseline. And so we also are seeing significant growth in this year as well. So that doesn't seem like a crazy number. Now we'll look at personnel. So in terms of wages, we're budgeting for 1,788.7 FTEs. For FY25, we have one additional FTE in the position table versus the approved FY24 position headcount. And that is one regulatory inspector supervisor within the for-hire vehicle administration or the taxi cab administration. We also like to give a breakdown of our overall workforce. So 76% of our total workforce is represented. And then you can see the breakdown by the different unions in the top table to the right. And as far as wage increases go this year, there has been a relatively high amount of uncertainty versus past budget cycles. And the reason is that 4 of our 5 unions are currently in negotiations. That includes the ATU, who represents our bus operators, the IBW, who represents bus mechanics, SMART, who represents our trolley employees, and then the IBW also has an agreement with our flag persons. And so this budget draft assumes 5% wage increases in FY25 for all those groups, except for flaggers, where we're increasing the wage from $18 to $23 to try to meet the demands of the new minimum wage environment. And then our 5th union is the TEOA that represents our security staff. That contract is set at 4% increases for FY25, so that's reflected in our budget. For non-represented employees, This budget draft assumed a 4% merit increase as well as a 1% performance improvement program bonus pool. Very important to note that this budget draft does not include any impact from the salary study that just went to the executive committee and is going to the board on Thursday. Depending on the outcome of that, we will either include it or not include it in the final draft that we bring in the next couple weeks. And then seeing how this translates into dollars on the wage side. So administration wages are projected to increase by just under 3 million or 14%. That's main driver here is the 60 new FTEs that we added in FY24, highlighted by the 47 new security positions. On the trolley side, wages are projected to increase by 4.7 million or almost 13%. Main driver here is the service increases coupled with the wage rate growth. So we're projecting that trolley operator hours are going to increase by 13.2%. We're also hiring the 15 additional flag persons for SB 125 Orange Line improvements. And that hiring will likely take place towards the end of FY24. And then on the bus operations side, we're projecting an increase in wages of 4.1 million or almost 9%. That once again is primary driver is service increases where we have bus operator hours projected to increase by 4.9%, coupled with the 5% wage increases. That's how we get to these figures. And so in total, we're projecting 117 million in base wages for FY25, which is an increase of almost 12 million over the FY24 amended budget. Then we have fringe benefits within personnel. So pension costs overall are expected to increase by 651,000 or 2.1%. So actual pension plan costs, which includes CalPERS as well as the San Diego Transit Defined Benefit Plan, are projected to increase by 1.3 million or almost 5%. Then also rolling up to pension, we have the pension obligation bond costs. Those costs are projected to will decrease by 1.8 million. We had our last payment in FY24, so we don't have any further debt obligations in FY25 or beyond. And then also rolling up to pension, we have the San Diego Transit Defined Contribution Plan, where we're budgeting for a $1.2 million increase or almost a 66% increase. And this is based on an assumption that we're going to increase the employer contribution for the DC plans from 6% to 9%. That's currently on the table, but is dependent upon labor negotiations. Also being discussed is the possibility to reopen the defined benefit plan. So if we do end up reopening the defined benefit plan, then we wouldn't see this increase to the defined contribution plan this year. Instead, we'd see the increase in FY26 in costs related to the defined benefit plan. Healthcare costs, we have increasing by about 3.3 million or almost 18%. We know the insurance premiums for calendar year 24 rates. For calendar year 25, we're assuming a 10% increase. And then we're also reflecting higher enrollment due to the hiring that we're doing in the second half of FY24. And then we're also reflecting some of the collective bargaining proposals that have been put forth in this number as well. And then we have paid absences increasing by about $1 million, primarily due to the wage growth, workers' compensation costs growing by 2.7%. And in total, we're projecting about 78 million in fringe costs this year, which is an increase of about 7% over the FY24 amended budget. Moving on to purchase transportation. So that's our contracted service. So main driver this year is our planned increases to service levels. And so we have two different contracts. We have the fixed route contract that's operated by Transdev. And so on this contract, we're projecting a 9.2% increase in service levels, which is measured by revenue miles. And then on the contract side, there's both a fixed and a variable rate. So the fixed costs are a monthly fee that we pay to the vendor, and it's not dependent upon service levels. And then we have a variable rate that is based on the amount of revenue miles that we operate. And that's the amount where the overall cost will be impacted by our service levels. The per revenue mile rate is increasing by 3% this year based on the contract. And then we also have our paratransit and minibus services, which are offered under the same contract. It was formerly operated by First Transit, but First Transit was bought out by Transdev or acquired by Transdev in late 2023. On that contract, we have fixed costs for both services increasing by 4.2%. And then on the variable side for paratransit, the rate, which is billed on a per hour basis, is increasing by 1.8%. Couple that with a projected increase in 18.7% in billable revenue hours. And then on the minibus side, the variable rate, which is the per mile rate, is increasing by 4.8%. And then we couple that with service levels projected increase by 7.2%, and we get to some pretty hefty increases this year. So for FY25, you can see those costs broken out by service. But we're projecting 113 million in total purchase transportation expenses, which is an increase of about 10 million or 10% from the FY24 budget. Once again, that's mostly due to the projected service increases. So now we have our outside services. So there's 4 categories under this category. So security is our contracted security. So we're projected to increase by 727,000 or 5.1% in FY25. That's mainly due to the contractual rate increase of 4%. We also have repair and maintenance costs, which are projected to decrease by 668,000. That's primarily within the track maintenance department, where we're seeing a decrease of 1.9 million, and that's the tire replacement project. So we had 3.7 million in FY24 based on a large scope that we're completing in FY24. We have a much smaller scope for FY25, and so we're reducing the amount for that down to 1 million in FY25. Also within repair and maintenance, we are expecting significant increases for our LRV repair costs. So we have a contract with a vendor who does all the body work, graffiti repairs, as well as painting, and that contract is expiring in FY25, and so we are expecting some significant increases on with the new contract. Next, we have engines and transmissions. So we're bringing the budget down by 166,000 or almost 19% here. We're budgeting for a more average experience. FY24 was particularly bad, and we're not going to automatically assume that we see that kind of year again. And then lastly, we have other services, which is increasing by 4 million or almost 19%. And this is due to a variety of new spending. So we have 951,000 in new spending for fare system upgrades, which includes things like open payment as well as mobile app enhancements. We have 1.4 million in new spending on a variety of IT initiatives, specifically new software implementations to support our security and rail operations. And then we also have 1.6 million in new spending for some bus and rail facility maintenance projects. Specifically, the operations wants to repaint all of the structures at the Fashion Valley Station. We have about $500,000 for South Bay maintenance facility pavement repairs, and then about $500,000 in Copley Park Division facility repairs in Kearney Mesa as well. And then lastly, we're adding 750,000 in expenses to this budget for the Baltimore and Euclid planning studies, which, as I mentioned earlier, are grant funded. So in total, our outside services are projected to be just under 54 million for FY25. So next we have energy. So one of the contributing factors here is the increase in service levels. So that drives our consumption. So we will have increasing energy costs due to that alone. I'm not going to spend time going into the rates because the rates that are built into this current forecast are going to change significantly for the better. So particularly on the CNG side, just within the last couple of weeks, we had some meetings with a variety of our vendors, and we got very positive feedback from them. We also asked for an estimate on if we were to fix our CNG price, what that would look like. And the amount that we would be able to fix that is actually lower than what was built into this current draft. So the commodity rate for CNG will be coming down significantly. In this draft, we were projecting about a $6.6 million increase. I'd expect to take about $1.5 million off of that for the final version. And we'll go into more detail on this at the next presentation. And then lastly, for expenses, we have a slide for other. So materials and supplies costs, we're projecting at just under 21 million for FY '25, or an increase of about 2 million. The main driver here is that we're including 1.1 million for drive unit overhauls for the SD8 fleet. That's a midlife overhaul that we need to do. And then 830,000 for the ticket vending machine credit card module upgrades. So they need to go in and install a piece of hardware on all of our TVMs to accommodate some of the upgrades that we're doing for the Pronto system. And then risk management costs are projected to increase by 2.8 million, or over 33%. Continues to be a very harsh market for insurance premiums. Our excess liability premiums are increasing 29% over the prior year. And then our property insurance premiums are increasing by almost 40%. That's partially due to the fact that we're insuring all of our mid-coast assets now as well. And then within risk, we also have legal costs projected to increase by 387,000. FY '24 was low because some of the cases that we thought might go to trial didn't end up going to trial. And so we're budgeting for a level closer to FY '23 based on our anticipated caseload. And then general and administration costs are projected to increase by 600,000. That's due to new spending, specifically 276,000 for new automatic passenger counters, as well as radios for the bus fleet. And then we're increasing the budget for spending on computers within IT by 136,000 based on that the refresh schedule for the computers. And so in total, these other categories are projected at 40.4 million for FY '25, which is an increase of about 5.3 million over FY '24. And so here you can see the summary of our expenses that we just covered. I think it's highlighted by personnel expenses as well as purchase transportation, which are highly dependent or impacted by our projected service level increases. So in total, we're projecting 457 million for expenses, which is an increase of 43 million, or 10.4% over the FY '24 amended budget. And then here is the fun slide where we look at revenues and expenses and our structural deficit. So our recurring revenues, we're projecting at 368 million for FY '25. We're projecting expenses of 457 million. So that puts us at a structural deficit for FY '25 at 88.6 million. In order to get to our overall balanced budget, we need to add back in the one-time funding as well as the reserve activity. So we add in the 47 million for our last year of stimulus funds, 20 million for SB 125, which we consider one-time in nature, and then the 22 million of operating deficit reserves funds that we plan on using to balance this budget in FY '25. And then just as a reminder, we are drawing the last 47 million of our stimulus funds. So this is the year where we start drawing from the operating deficit reserve. So on this slide, I wanted to give a snapshot of what the deficit reserve looks like now and where we think it's going to look at the end of FY '25. So you can see in FY '23, we ended the year with excess revenues over expenses of 61 million. That was from drawing our maximum stimulus funds based on eligible expenses rather than need. Then after reserve adjustments, we were able to contribute just under 57 million to the operating deficit reserve. So that's where the level currently is today. That's what's sitting in the reserve. The next contribution will be at the end of FY '24. And based on the amended budget, we plan on being able to contribute an additional 30.2 million. So that would leave us with a balance of just over 87 million at the end of FY '24. And then based on the budget draft for FY '25 that we're presenting today, we plan on needing to use 22 million in operating deficit reserve funds to balance our budget for FY '25, which would leave us with a remaining balance of about 65 million at the end of FY '25. And so we're still working on the official 5-year forecast, but we do expect that 65 million to get us through roughly one more fiscal year. And then not included here is that our SB 125 plan that was submitted to the state includes an additional 75 million of funds specifically allocated towards balancing the structural deficit. But as mentioned, there is uncertainty around those funds, at a minimum, the timing, but possibly the amount as well. So that's something we need to consider looking forward. But that, if we do receive that amount, would likely get us through an additional fiscal year. So we're really looking at the end of FY '27 or very early FY '28 to where we would need to start addressing the structural deficit. And so that brings us to this slide. We do think it's appropriate to start making changes now.
Gordon, why don't I take this slide,
Sure.
if you don't mind? So, yeah, obviously, it's even more grim than we thought, based on the sales tax projections and the fact that we haven't been achieving the fair revenue that we thought we would get. And so there are some steps that we think we could take now in order to start to address it, with the long-term potential of being a much more significant lift. But a couple of things, we've already brought this to the Public Security Committee, which is the change the fare diversion program to increase compliance. The one thing that's challenging for us is that board added in that we have to allow everybody to buy a fare, give them that option. So that now we're finding that a lot of people just wait. If they get caught, they pay for the fare and then they move on. And so if we took that away, it would hopefully incentivize people to comply. And obviously we would keep data on it and bring it back to the board. But that would require a fare diversion change through the board. And then another one is we have this methodology that we put in place to make sure our capital program was kept up to date. We had a very significant, 20 years ago, huge deficit in state of good repair. We've since corrected for that. And we're seeing historic levels of funding in our capital program, in part because of new programs, the low-no program at the federal government side, as well as the state of good repair and SB1 programs at the state level. And we've been very highly successful, our grants team, in getting grant funding for capital. So one thing that the feds allow you to do is to flex your preventative maintenance funding that they give, because primarily the federal government wants to only fund capital. But they do understand that they don't want to fund buses and then not have transit operations being able to maintain them. So they do let you flex some of that funding to show that you're actually using it to keep the things that they've bought in good repair. So we've artificially ourselves here at MTS kind of limited how much of that we flex into the operating budget over time. We haven't really changed that significantly. Larry, I can't remember the last time we've changed the percentage or the amount. It's actually not a percentage, it's a fixed amount. So that's something that we could do. Seeing that we have this historically huge capital program, and that we have been working on state of good repair now for many, many years, we could potentially change that dynamic and put some of that back into operations for preventative maintenance. Those are two easy ones that we could get done right away. We also put state STA into the capital program. And again, that was an intentional thing because the state has to fund that and they've historically sometimes taken it. So we have tried to minimize how much of that we're putting into the operations, since it's not entirely in our control and it's volatile. Other things would be if the board wanted to tell us scale back the planned service increases, because as you saw, we're planning to increase 9% this coming fiscal year. We could delay that. But on the other hand, I mean, it is our operations. This is what we do. We're supposed to be actually putting service on the road. And then fare increases, obviously, is another way that you can change your budgetary deficits. And then you could slow the ZEB transition, which I totally understand that the board is 100% committed to trying to accelerate that. So I'm not suggesting any of those. So the first two are the ones that I would suggest we take a look at in the more immediate sense, and then ultimately see what happens over the course of the next fiscal year. With that, I'll turn it.
Before we go to the committee comments, we want to make sure that the public is covered. Oh, this is not fit, it's not fit, I apologize, I thought this was finished. Go ahead.
Would it be
Almost there.
possible if I
One-
could just ask a quick
I
question?
would prefer the questions and comments at the end,
Okay.
just to give the public
Yeah.
their due diligence.
Okay, so last slide, just on the next steps. So we're taking this same presentation to the board on Thursday, and then we're going to finalize the operating budget over the next few days, particularly make a decision on the salary study impact and whether or not to include that. Do our final look at energy prices before rolling up, and then we'll prepare the full budget book, and then we'll bring that to the presentation to the BDC on May 8th, and then ultimately to the board at the public hearing scheduled for May 16th. And with that, be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Clerk, do we have any public comments?
We have no public comments, Chair.
Wonderful, thank you. Mayor McCann?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Sharon, for your update. On the SDA funding, you were saying that we sometimes receive it, sometimes don't. And I'm just concerned with the current deficit that the state of California has. It continues to grow. And right now it's at $73 billion, a very substantial issue. When I'm talking with our state representatives, they're getting more and more concerned. So what is the probability we will get that SDA funding?
So for the next fiscal year, it's already been established how much we get, correct?
So it's still an estimate. This one was based on the January governor's proposal, and then we'll receive a more refined projection in the May governor's proposal as well.
Yeah,
So-
so the only thing with this STA is that the California Transit Association sued the administration years ago because they took it away and it was found to be unconstitutional. And so that resulted in a negotiated agreement as to the levels of STA that would be provided to transit operators. They pegged it to the diesel tax, which that is clearly something that's going away. Eventually, the goal is to have no more diesel in the state of California. So that to us will mean that at some point it will dwindle down. But as for now, they projected higher than previously assumed, based on sales. And it is a sales tax on diesel, so it's pegged to the price.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wonderful, and I just want to remind the committee that this is an actionable item, so I will need a motion in a second. Councilmember Goble?
Thank you, Chair. Gordon, great presentation. Thank you. Very thorough. To cover a lot of ground in just 40 minutes or less, which is great. Let's go back to slide 12, please. So this is the revenue summary, and I'm going to focus on the top line, passenger revenue. So in the 2024 column, 74,558 is 18% of total revenue, if I did my math right. In FY25, the 80,125 drops to 17.5% of the 457. That's a little concerning to me that passenger revenue as a percent of total revenue, which is zero-based as expenses, is dropping. Our percent of revenue from passenger revenue is dropping. On the bright side, I think our open source payment should help that. I also am concerned about the penalty of just pay a fare, because there really is no penalty. If you get caught without a fare, you just have to buy a fare. And that's, I guess we can debate the merits of that later, but certainly the economics of that are our percent of passenger revenue is dropping, and that concerns me. At some point, we just have to pay for this system somehow. Let's go forward to slide 19, please. That is 18, one more. 19. This is the energy thing. Okay, on a global scale, I see here electricity costs, the electric portion, you're saying you're forecasting a 14% increase in the cost of electricity plus a 4.4% increase for transmission? Am I reading that right? Under the bullet points under electricity costs.
Yeah, so for we purchase, so the transmission and demand rate is through SDG&E. So on that, we're forecasting a 4.4% increase. That makes up a component of our overall rate that we pay. And then the commodity price, actually, I don't have that broken out here. This is what these forecasts are based on, but these will be changing significantly. But that is,
That's the cost of electricity, the commodity price, rather than the transmission price, because I believe our bills have those two components. Am I?
Yeah, and we
Yeah.
go through direct access, so it's not purchasing it through SDG&E.
Of course, but my point is the cost of electricity is increasing 14%. That's pretty fast. As we transition to an all-electric fleet, we're very vulnerable to some high electricity increases each year, just because that's the nature of that versus CNG, there's not as much demand, 2.5% increase, and probably the demand for CNG will be less. Where I'm going with this is, are we going to have enough electricity? Is in society in California, as we build these overhead grids for our charging systems, we're creating a demand for electricity. Because the more electric buses we buy, the more electricity needs to be created. And unless I'm not getting everything, the supply and demand of electricity, the more demand you put, the higher the price, unless the supply just somehow exceeds demand.
yes.
Are we headed that direction? Do we have enough electricity?
So we just had a meeting with Calpine, who is our direct access vendor who we purchased the commodity from. They have the same concerns. Now, they are required to purchase, they call it resource adequacy, but they have to purchase an amount of the commodity that they have available above the projected demand on the grid. But they're having trouble, or other vendors are having trouble meeting that requirement, because there is demand is forecasted to increase by a sizable amount, and so that it is hard, especially if they want to purchase renewable resources for that as well. So it is definitely a concern on their side as well, and this is their bread and butter, and they do have this same concern.
And with energy costs being roughly 10 or 11% of the total budget, it seems like that's a significant risk in future fiscal years. If the supply is not keeping up with the demand's only going to drive price up. This year, it's a 14% increase. In future years, I don't see that 14% dropping. So I think we just should be aware as we forecast future fiscal years, like a 5-year plan, to consider that there may be a significant price increases in the cost of electricity because demand may exceed supply or tighten. So that's a comment there. Let's go to slide 20. And while I'm still back on the supply and demand of electric buses, that is a reason to have a discussion. I think regulations require us to purchase a certain percent of our new vehicles as electric. So there are some government regulations, but to the sense that we have flexibility in that, I think that is a discussion that we should have, because the more we convert to something that costs more to operate will affect future fiscal years. And that is a discussion to have at some point with the board. Related to electric buses, they're heavier. And I've heard that the cost of tires, for instance, on passenger electric cars, are not quite the same as the cost of tires on combustible engine cars. Have we factored in future years costs related to the weight of the vehicle, such as do we need to increase costs for the asphalt that they're parked on, the tires that they drive on, the increased costs related to electric vehicles versus the one we have today?
Mike, can you address that?
Sure. Mike Wygant, Chief Operating Officer. All excellent questions. I'll try to cover a few of them. As far as the tires, that's really not an issue as far as additional costs as related to tires for an electric bus versus like a car. Cars, absolutely. The conversion to battery electric creates a lot more horsepower and torque. Thus, the consumption of the tire, the rubber usage goes up drastically. It's not really an issue with the bus. A bus is quite a bit heavier, and then the balance of it to try to at the same time incorporate as much battery to thus have range is something that the OEMs are working through. But we're still at an axle limit within the state and our region that we're not allowed to exceed. There's some discussion at the state and the federal level that that may someday get increased to allow this transition. Back to your electricity questions, those are great questions that the state and the national level are looking at as far as the portfolio within our utilities and the ability to meet our requirements for this transition. For the next two deployments of overhead charging, for instance, at our divisions, we have the grid capacity, but after that, it's going to require upgrades for San Diego Gas and Electric. And yes, they're concerned with that balance, especially as light duty increases. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is when you're talking about the electric rate, right now we're able to charge our electric vehicles on the off-peak or super off-peak. Eventually, as we continue through this transition, we won't have that luxury. We won't be able to make service. So not only will we have to incorporate the costs of the commodity and the transmission increasing, but we may also have to start dipping into more expensive times of the electricity rate. But that's kind of built into our plan. So all good questions.
One more question while you're there. The range of miles of the new electric buses, are they comparable to the range of the CNG buses?
No, they're not even half. Right now, the versions that we have, we can't plan for anything more than about 140. We even have Arctic buses that go nearly 500. Now, the newest versions of electric buses that have just come out will get closer to 200, but the technology has not advanced to that level yet.
So we saw that our personnel expenses increased 11.5% in 1 year on one of the earlier slides. And that's due to increased service levels and increased wage levels combined. So are we going to need more electric buses to replace the current fleet of buses? And does that mean more people to run those buses? And do I need 2 electric buses to replace 1 CNG buses? Do I need 2 drivers here to replace 1 drivers here?
So right now, we're not planning for that until
Right.
the future, when we actually have been exploring, and Mike's the lead on that as well, hydrogen in order to accommodate the longer routes.
Right.
So the goal would never be to have a 2-for-1 replacement on a bus. You'd want to only have the 1-for-1.
Our transition plan, as it is today, is written with a 1-for-1 replacement. The state's regulation has some off-ramps if for some reason you had to go away from that, but that's something, a decision that the board would have to make. There are, as Sharon mentioned, other fuel type options, hydrogen that could give you more range, but hydrogen also doesn't go 500 miles. The assumption is that technology will continue to improve. The OEMs and the sub-OEMs suppliers will make advancements that continue to see range improve, whether it be battery, electric, or hydrogen. Right now, we probably have about a little over 40% of our routes that could be operated by the technology today. But we've got a long ways to go.
Yeah, Mike just saw the Gillig bus, the 40-foot, has as many batteries on it as Arctic, correct?
Correct. It has more than 600 kilowatts of onboard storage, which is what you could only on a 40-foot bus, which translates to almost 200 miles. That's comparable to what we have on a 60-foot bus. But because the 60-foot bus is 30% heavier, it gets reduced range.
But they had to re-engineer the entire bus in order to make.
Right. The whole front end's different because in that case, they're transitioning more of the weight towards the front axle where there was some room within the state and the federal government's axle weight limits.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Good answers. One more final question on slide 23. And if I'm hearing this right, the 65 million in the green bar will get us through 2026. If we get SB 125, that may buy us another couple of years. Am I hearing that right?
Correct. And that's just high level, looking at what we have now. We are building out the official 5-year forecast, which we'll present at the next meeting as well.
And so when we run out of reserves, whether that's in 25 or in 28, then we either have to raise fares, reduce service, or a combination of both. What it sounds like,
Or find another source of revenue.
or find another source of revenue. Well, 80%, looks like close to 80% or something, more than 50% is already subsidy. So even then, that means more tax revenue from the federal or the state. So it is what it is. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And this is an actionable item, so if I may, if my colleague, it's not? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was an actionable item. Well, thank you for the discussion. Did you want to say?
Yeah, I
ahead.
just wanted to thank Gordon and the staff for doing a great report, and thanks Sharon, and back to you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, thank you. I think there's an appetite here to have an update on possibly a ZEB conversation. Can I say that? Not today. I'm saying an item in the future about our transition plan for electrification and just a ZEB conversation in general. I don't know if that happens here in the budget committee or if it happens at the board level.
Yeah, we have to bring it back to the board each year. So I believe it's scheduled now for the June board meeting.
Currently on the agenda for the June board meeting.
Wonderful. And I think it would be prudent of us to maybe add a little bit of the detail of the future of the budget, just so we can get our conversation piece correct, especially considering the capital improvement projects that were mentioned in this report earlier. And obviously the capital improvement projects that are slated to happen in the South Bay, as well as the new facility, that definitely will change the conversation. But thank you for that. We'll be ready in June, right, you guys? And so I do appreciate that the federal support MTS received during the pandemic. I mean, it will certainly run out one day, but I do want to commend staff for using this federal support wisely, including creating our operation deficit reserve to supplement our budget through fiscal year 2026. Even more importantly, I'm very pleased that we use the time the federal support gave us to try to grow our ridership. I actually saw that graph a little bit different from, I don't remember what page that was, but where you mentioned the ridership fare. No, it was the fare, no, it was another one that showcased the amount of funding that was brought in. It was slide 12. I noticed in that whole slide that SB 125 jumps considerably from 4.5 to 19, which obviously makes the 74 to 80 difference. But you know, from what we've seen in previous items, the efforts to grow our ridership have definitely borne some fruit. Our passenger revenue continues to grow. Even if it's at a slight rate than what we projected mid-year. And so while we continue to have challenges with our structural budget deficit, I think this agency is in very good standing and in very good shape, especially compared to many of the local governments, right, in the state of California. I don't even want to mention the city of San Diego right now, but we are looking at a big structural deficit. So ultimately, I believe MTS needs obviously more local funding to support its operations long-term. I would encourage staff to look at potential revenue options that could be pursued in 2026. I don't know how early we have to start talking about that conversation, but certainly if it's going to come out of the budget committee, I want to start sooner rather than later. And so with that, this is not an actionable item, and this concludes this item. Thank you, Mr. Meyer, for your presentation. And we are going to move on to item number 5, which is our next meeting date in May 8th at 1 p.m. And so this brings us to item number 6, which is the adjournment. Go ahead.
If I could before, I just wanted to highlight that Mike Thompson has been promoted to Deputy CFO. Mike has many years of service here at MTS, and you've seen him in the chair many times talking about our finances. He's now going to be also assuming the procurement side of the house as well as some other responsibilities moving forward. So we're really pleased to announce that today.
Well, congratulations from this committee. And thank you all for your attendance and your input. The meeting of the MTS Budget Development Committee is now adjourned, and have a nice rest of your day. Thank you.